The Grand Canyon, vast, ancient, and silent, stretches across the Arizona desert like an open wound carved by time itself. Millions visit its towering cliffs each year, marveling at its beauty, never realizing that beneath the sunlight and sandstone, a darker story may lie buried, one of discovery, mystery, and perhaps deliberate silence. In April 1909, a small Arizona newspaper published an article that would ignite one of the most enduring legends in American history. The Arizona Gazette reported that a man named G. E. Kincaid, exploring the Colorado River under the sponsorship of the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered a network of underground tunnels within the Grand Canyon. What he claimed to find inside defied everything known about the ancient history of North America. Kincaid described vast chambers cut into solid rock, filled with relics that seemed to belong to another world, hieroglyphic symbols, mummified bodies, and statues resembling deities from both Egyptian and Asian civilizations. He wrote of long, carved passageways leading deeper into the canyon, and rooms filled with copper tools, golden idols, and mysterious tablets engraved with symbols unknown to modern scholars. If true, the discovery would have rewritten not just American history, but the history of civilization itself. Yet soon after the article's publication, everything about the story vanished. The Smithsonian denied any record of such an expedition. Kincaid's name disappeared from official documents, and the cave, whose supposed entrance was described in detail, was never seen again. To understand this mystery, we must return to the early 1900s, a time when explorers and archaeologists were racing to uncover humanity's forgotten past. The world had recently been stunned by discoveries in Egypt's Valley of the Kings and the temples of Asia. American scientists were desperate to prove that their own land, too, held secrets as old as those across the ocean. In this atmosphere of curiosity and ambition, a lone explorer drifting down the Colorado River would have been seen as a hero or a madman. G. Kincaid claimed to have stumbled upon something so profound that it could connect the civilizations of the Old World and the New. But as with many who find something that threatens accepted truths, his story was quickly buried, perhaps literally. The Arizona Gazette article described a massive citadel buried deep within the canyon walls, large enough to house 50,000 people. It spoke of Buddhist idols, Egyptian mummies, and a chamber said to be a burial crypt lined with artifacts of copper and gold. The writer hinted that this discovery proved ancient migration, that travelers from the East, possibly Egyptians or Asians, had reached America long before Columbus, long before recorded history. But the Smithsonian's silence was deafening. No report, no evidence, no acknowledgement that the story had ever existed. To the scientific community, the claim was either a hoax or an inconvenient truth best left forgotten. Yet even now, over a century later, the mystery refuses to die. Researchers and explorers have searched for any mention of G. Kincaid in Smithsonian archives, census records, and geological surveys, but found nothing. His name appears nowhere. The expedition logs, the supposed artifacts, even the reporter who wrote the story, all seem to have vanished. Still, parts of the Grand Canyon remain off-limits to the public. Certain regions, particularly those near the Marble Canyon and Kincaid Plateau, are restricted by the U.S. government, patrolled, and carefully monitored. Why? Officials claim it's for environmental protection and native heritage preservation. Yet these are the same areas described in the 1909 article, the same areas where Kincaid's tunnels were supposedly found. Skeptics argue that the Arizona Gazette story was pure fabrication, part of the lost civilization craze of the early 20th century, when newspapers published fantastical tales to sell copies. But others insist that the details in the report were too specific to be made up. The article named exact locations, used technical geological terms, and referenced the Smithsonian's involvement, details that would have required some insider knowledge. Moreover, there were earlier reports, even before 1909, of strange sealed entrances and carved doorways spotted by explorers in the canyon. Local native tribes, including the Hopi, spoke of underground dwellings and ant people, beings who once lived below the earth and emerged only after great disasters. Could these ancient legends be echoes of a forgotten truth? For centuries, The Grand Canyon has held spiritual significance for indigenous peoples, a place of beginnings and rebirth. But for archaeologists, it remains a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Even today, new caves and ancient dwellings are discovered in its vast wilderness. Yet none match the grandeur of what Kincaid described, a sprawling underground city, complete with passageways, crypts, and statues of foreign gods. If such a site truly exists, its discovery would force historians to rewrite humanity's migration map and acknowledge that advanced civilizations may have reached North America long before Europe's age of exploration. Why, then, would such a discovery be silenced? Some believe the answer lies with the Smithsonian itself. In the early 1900s, the institution held near total control over archaeology in America. It was the authority on what was, and wasn't, considered authentic. A find suggesting contact between ancient Egypt or Asia and the Americas would have upended the accepted narrative of human history. Worse, it might have undermined the Smithsonian's credibility and its leadership in defining that history. Covering it up would have been simpler and safer. Over the decades, whispers of the Kincaid cave have surfaced repeatedly. Modern explorers claim to have found blocked tunnels and sealed doors high above the canyon floor, entrances resembling those in the original report. But attempts to explore them have been met with sudden restrictions, fines, and even threats from federal authorities. Coincidence? Or protection of something far older and more valuable than gold? To this day, the Smithsonian continues to deny any connection to G. Kincaid or his supposed discovery. But questions remain. Why are certain areas of the canyon completely closed to the public? Why do some maps show blank or redacted zones? And why does the legend persist, surviving more than a century of denial and disappearance? The answer may lie not in the canyon itself, but in the records, or rather, in what was erased from them. Somewhere, deep in the archives of history, lies the truth about what Kincaid found, or what he was never meant to find. And so begins our journey into the depths of the Grand Canyon, into the forbidden zones where myth and archaeology collide. Because if the story of G. Kincaid is true, then beneath the heart of America lies not just a geological wonder, but the ruins of a forgotten civilization, a civilization that time, and perhaps power, tried to erase. The year was 1770. Boston, once a bustling port city filled with merchants and craftsmen, had turned into a nest of unrest. The British redcoats, sent to maintain order, patrolled the streets like silent predators. Their presence was a daily reminder that the people of the colonies were no longer free men but subjects under an empire's watchful eye. The resentment simmered like hot tar under a wooden deck, quiet but ready to ignite. On a bitterly cold evening in March, the first spark flared. A crowd of colonists gathered around the customs house, shouting insults at a lone British sentry. Snowballs turned into stones, stones into fists, and soon, into bullets. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow, their blood staining the cobblestones of King Street. The British called it an unfortunate riot. The colonists named it something else, the Boston Massacre. The massacre became the talk of every tavern and church from New England to Virginia. Paul Revere's engraving of the event spread like wildfire, showing the redcoats as cold-blooded killers. The British Parliament, underestimating the power of storytelling, had just handed the revolutionaries their first weapon, outrage. In the shadows of the massacre, men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock began organizing what would soon be called the Sons of Liberty. 3 years later, the tension boiled over again, this time over tea. The British East India Company, drowning in debt, convinced Parliament to pass the Tea Act, forcing colonists to buy their tea only from them. The colonies saw it as another shackle. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships docked in Boston Harbor. Without a single word, they hurled 342 chests of British tea into the freezing waters. The sea turned dark with leaves, and the world turned silent, until the next morning when the news broke across the Atlantic. King George III was furious. The colonists must be punished, he declared. The British Parliament responded with a series of harsh laws, the Coercive Acts, shutting down Boston's port and placing the city under military control. But instead of breaking the spirit of the colonies, Britain had done the opposite. From Georgia to Massachusetts, The cry spread like thunder. If they can close Boston today, they can close us tomorrow. Soon, delegates from 12 colonies met for the first time in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and John Adams stood in a candlelit hall and discussed the unthinkable: unity. Henry's voice thundered, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." For the first time in history, the idea of America was born. But even as these men debated, British troops marched quietly from Boston to seize weapons stored by colonial militias in Concord. In the early dawn of April 19, 1775, the first shots were fired on Lexington Green. No one knew who fired first, but history remembers it as the shot heard round the world. Within hours, colonial farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers grabbed their muskets and joined the fight. They weren't trained soldiers, but they had something the redcoats didn't: a cause worth dying for. As smoke filled the Massachusetts countryside, one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The war for independence had begun, and the 13 colonies were about to challenge the most powerful empire on earth. The year was 1775, a year that would forever alter the destiny of the New World. The spring air over Massachusetts carried more than the scent of blooming trees. It carried the smell of gunpowder, rebellion, and destiny. After the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, there was no longer any illusion of peace between the colonies and Britain. The British Army had marched confidently out of Boston, expecting to crush a band of untrained farmers and return before breakfast. Instead, they were met with a storm. Hidden behind stone walls and trees, local militiamen fired relentlessly as the redcoats retreated. By the time the British soldiers staggered back to Boston, nearly 300 of them were dead or wounded. The colonists had won their first unofficial battle, and their courage began to spread like wildfire through the 13 colonies. In the weeks that followed, militias from across New England surrounded Boston. What began as scattered resistance was now transforming into something far greater: an organized fight for freedom. Yet, the men outside the city walls were hardly soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and teachers, armed with hunting muskets and fiery determination. They had courage, yes, but they lacked discipline, leadership, and a clear strategy. If they were to stand against the mighty British Empire, they needed something stronger than courage. They needed unity in an army. Hundreds of miles away, in the bustling city of Philadelphia, the air inside Carpenter's Hall was heavy with debate. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, bringing together the sharpest minds from every colony. John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia sat among others whose words would one day echo through history. The question before them was simple yet terrifying. Should they raise a national army? To do so would mean open rebellion, treason punishable by death. John Adams rose to speak. His voice carried a weight of conviction that filled the hall. "Gentlemen," he declared, "the die is cast. We must take command of this war, for it has already begun." Some delegates nodded. Others looked pale with fear. Adams continued, "We must appoint a commander-in-chief, someone who commands respect, who understands discipline, and who can unite this cause under one flag." The room fell silent. Then, as if by instinct, all eyes turned toward one man, tall, calm, and composed, dressed in a modest Virginia militia uniform. His name was George Washington. Washington had come to Philadelphia quietly, not seeking command or glory, but his demeanor spoke volumes. A veteran of the French and Indian War, he carried the presence of someone who understood the chaos of battle and the burden of leadership. When Adams nominated him, Washington appeared surprised and humbled. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he said modestly. But Congress saw in him what the colonies needed: strength, dignity, and unity. On June 15, 1775, the motion passed unanimously. George Washington was appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That night, Washington wrote to his wife, Martha, "I am embarked on a cause from which I can never turn back," he said. "I have no desire for glory, only that I may be found faithful to my duty." The next morning, he set out for Boston to take command of the troops. unaware that before his arrival, the revolution's first great battle would already be raging. On June 17, 1775, colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill overlooking Boston Harbor. The British, determined to crush the rebellion, launched a full-scale assault. From the top of the hill, the colonists watched as the red lines of British soldiers advanced, bayonets gleaming, drums beating. They had little ammunition and few trained men. Their commander, Colonel William Prescott, shouted the legendary order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The hill erupted in musket fire. The British fell in waves, their ranks torn apart by the colonists' ferocity. But eventually, the defenders' ammunition ran out, and the British took the hill, though at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded. For the colonists, the Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a loss, but in spirit, it was a triumph. They had stood their ground against the most powerful army in the world. Washington arrived soon after. He saw the determination of his men and realized something profound. This was no longer a rebellion. It was the birth of a revolution. Yet, the army he inherited was far from what he envisioned. The camps around Boston were disorganized and dirty. Men of all ages carried mismatched weapons, some without shoes, some without food, and most without training. Supplies were short and discipline was scarce. But Washington did not despair. Riding through the camps, he spoke calmly to the men, learning their names, praising their courage, and instilling a sense of purpose. He brought order where there was chaos, dividing troops into regiments, establishing drills, and enforcing strict but fair discipline. Slowly, the ragtag militias began to resemble a real army, the Continental Army. Washington's leadership went beyond strategy. He understood that wars were not won only with weapons, but with endurance. Perseverance and spirit, he once said, have done wonders in all ages. Under his command, morale rose, and men began to believe that they were fighting for something far greater than survival. They were fighting for liberty. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Congress took on the daunting task of supporting the army. They printed their own paper currency, managed supplies, and established committees for correspondence with foreign allies. For the first time, the colonies acted as one. The foundation of a nation was forming. Despite the growing unity, many in Congress still hoped for peace. They drafted the Olive Branch Petition, a final appeal to King George III, expressing loyalty while requesting justice and the repeal of oppressive laws. The petition was sent across the Atlantic with trembling hope. But King George refused even to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion, commanding his armies to crush the uprising. The message was clear. There would be no compromise, only war. In Boston, Washington faced his first great test. The British army remained entrenched inside the city, their ships guarding the harbor. The Continental Army surrounded them, but lacked the heavy artillery to launch an attack. Then came an idea and a hero. Colonel Henry Knox, a bookseller with a passion for artillery, volunteered to retrieve cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Through blizzards, frozen rivers, and treacherous terrain, Knox and his men dragged 60 tons of iron cannons across 300 miles of wilderness using oxen and sledges. It was one of the most astonishing feats of the war. By March 1776, the cannons arrived. Under the cover of night, Washington's men positioned them atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. When dawn broke, the British awoke to find dozens of cannons aimed directly at them. Realizing their position was hopeless, they surrendered the city. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston, a stunning victory for the Continental Army. The people of Boston filled the streets with cheers. Church bells rang, flags waved, and for the first time, freedom felt within reach. Washington watched the British ships fade into the horizon with solemn pride. He knew it was only the beginning. The British would return, and next time, they would come with overwhelming force. Still, this victory proved that America could stand. It proved that courage, unity, and belief could overcome empires. As the year progressed, A transformation spread through the colonies. Men and women no longer saw themselves as British subjects, but as something new, Americans. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense circulated everywhere, arguing that monarchy was unnatural and that liberty was a right given by God. These are the times that try men's souls, Paine wrote, igniting hope in every tavern and town square. The fire of independence had begun to burn too brightly to be extinguished. Yet, in the spring of 1776, dark clouds loomed on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, the British were preparing their response, the largest military invasion in history at the time. Dozens of warships, carrying tens of thousands of troops, set sail for New York. Washington knew the odds were impossible. His army was small, under-equipped, and barely trained. But he also knew something the British didn't, that the fight was no longer about victory alone. It was about survival, freedom, and identity. As Washington looked across the harbor, he wrote in his journal, "We have proclaimed a cause worth every sacrifice. Let the world know the liberty of America shall not fall." The road to freedom would be long, bloody, and uncertain. But now, there was no turning back. A nation was awakening, and the world was about to change forever. The embers of revolution now glowed across the colonies. The farmers of Lexington had become soldiers. The scattered militias had transformed into the Continental Army. And a man from Virginia, humble and steadfast, had taken command of a cause larger than any crown could comprehend. Yet, beneath the triumphs and courage, one question burned in every mind. What exactly were they fighting for? Freedom was a word whispered in tents and taverns, but it was not yet a promise. No document bound them together. No nation existed to claim the victories they fought for. Each battle brought pride, but also uncertainty. Could 13 colonies, separated by distance, culture, and fear, truly stand as one? As Washington rode through the silent camps under the cold stars of March 1776, he looked at the faces of men who had left their homes, their families, and their futures. Some were little more than boys. Yet in their eyes, he saw something that gave him strength belief. The belief that liberty was worth every sacrifice. The belief that even the most powerful empire could be defied. The revolution had begun, but the idea of America was still being written, not on parchment yet, but in blood, sweat, and faith. As dawn broke over the endless walls of the Grand Canyon, the first rays of sunlight illuminated the Colorado River like a ribbon of gold slicing through the heart of an ancient mystery. Kincaid, exhausted yet restless from his previous night's discovery, stood at the canyon's edge, staring into the abyss. He could still feel the tremor of awe that shook him when he first glimpsed those carvings, symbols unlike any he had seen in his years of exploration. They whispered of a civilization older than Egypt, a people whose history had been buried under the dust of centuries. The world around him was silent, but Kincaid could sense that he was not alone. The very rocks seemed to hum with secrets, as if time itself had sealed something sacred within the canyon shadows. He began his descent once again, lowering himself by rope into the cavern's mouth. This time, he carried lanterns, rope, water, and a revolver, for he could not shake the feeling that the darkness below was alive. He lit the lantern, and the flames' glow danced across the walls. The room expanded into a vast chamber, larger than any cathedral. What Kincaid saw next would challenge everything he had ever believed. Lining the walls were sculptures of figures in strange headdresses, neither Egyptian nor Native American, but something between the two. In their hands, they held tools shaped like lightning bolts, and at their feet rested symbols that resembled both hieroglyphs and runic letters. He walked deeper into the chamber, and the flickering light revealed rows of stone coffins, perfectly aligned, each containing a preserved body. Their features were hauntingly human, yet subtly foreign. Elongated skulls, delicate bone structures, and garments woven with gold fibers. The air was heavy with an ancient stillness, as if time had stopped here thousands of years ago. Kincaid's mind raced. Could this be evidence of an unknown civilization that once thrived in North America? A civilization erased from history? He sketched feverishly, making notes to send back to the Smithsonian. But deep inside, he feared what discovery might bring. He had read tales of explorers who vanished after unearthing truths too great for their time. The next chamber was even more unsettling. There, in the center of the cavern, stood a massive statue, a deity-like figure with a serpent's body and a human face, its eyes embedded with gemstones that shimmered eerily in the lamplight. Surrounding the statue were offerings, gold cups, silver ornaments, and objects carved from crystal that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Kincaid realized that this was no tomb. It was a temple, a place of worship perhaps built by travelers from another land, long before recorded history. He noticed tunnels branching in every direction, hundreds of them, leading deeper into the canyon's underbelly. It was as though an entire underground city had been carved out by hands more skilled than any known ancient culture. When he touched the walls, the stone felt smooth, polished by tools that seemed far too advanced for their time. The realization struck him hard. This place should not exist. Kincaid decided to leave, determined to alert the Smithsonian. But as he retraced his steps, he felt a low vibration echoing through the ground. The air grew colder. A faint whisper seemed to drift through the passage, a voice so soft it could have been the wind, or something else entirely. You should not have come. Panic surged within him. The flame of his lantern flickered violently, then died. In total darkness, he groped for his matches, his hands trembling. He managed to relight the flame, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The coffins he had passed earlier were now open. He ran through the tunnels, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats in a nightmare. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of ancient tongues. Just when he thought he was lost, he stumbled into a narrow shaft that led upward toward the surface. With every ounce of strength, he climbed until daylight broke through above. When he emerged, gasping for air, the canyon looked unchanged, silent and eternal, as though mocking his terror. Weeks later, newspapers across the country carried strange headlines. Explorer discovers lost city beneath the Grand Canyon. The Smithsonian, when contacted, denied all knowledge of G. Kincaid or his alleged findings. His photographs vanished. His letters stopped. And soon, so did he. Some say he was silenced. Others believe he never left the canyon at all, that his spirit still wanders its depths, guarding secrets too powerful for humankind to know. But a few, driven by curiosity and obsession, have tried to find the entrance he described. None have succeeded. Even today, pilots flying low over the canyon report strange lights flickering near Marble Canyon at night. Locals speak of sounds echoing through the cliffs, rhythmic, like chants from another time. The government has long restricted access to certain sections, citing safety concerns. But for those who listen closely, the canyon still hums, as if whispering reminders of the lost civilization beneath its surface. The truth may never be revealed, but one thing is certain. What Kincaid found was real enough to frighten those who hold the keys to history. And so, the legend lives on, buried beneath layers of denial, stone, and time itself. This is not just a myth. This is a story written in the earth, waiting to be unearthed again. The year was 1909, and America was on the edge of discovery. Newspapers carried stories of new frontiers, lost civilizations, and scientific triumphs. Yet among these headlines, one story stood apart, strange, almost unbelievable. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published an article describing an explorer named G. Kincaid and his incredible discovery, a vast underground city hidden deep within the Grand Canyon, filled with mummies, hieroglyphs, and artifacts that bore an uncanny resemblance to ancient Egyptian culture. The Smithsonian Institution, the article claimed, had taken over the investigation. For a moment, the world was stunned. Then, almost overnight, the story vanished. No follow-ups, no official confirmation, not even a denial at first. Just silence. That silence, however, would grow into one of the most enduring historical mysteries of the modern age. To this day, the Smithsonian maintains that no record of Kincaid or his discovery exists. Yet fragments of letters, journals, and testimonies suggest otherwise. It is as if someone had carefully erased a chapter of history, line by line, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Smithsonian Institution was more than just a museum. It was the gatekeeper of human history. Funded by Congress and trusted by the public, it held immense power over what stories were told and which ones were buried. Archaeology was not just science, it was politics, culture, and control. Admitting that an ancient civilization had existed in North America long before Columbus would have rewritten everything scholars believed about the origins of the Western world. The theory that ancient Egyptians or other advanced civilizations might have reached America thousands of years ago was unthinkable at that time. It challenged the entire foundation of Western academia. For the Smithsonian, and for those shaping America's identity, such an idea could never be allowed to stand. Over the years, a handful of surviving letters began to surface. Some were said to have been written by Kincaid himself, others by river guides or locals near Marble Canyon. They spoke of crates marked SI, Smithsonian Institution, being loaded onto government steamers bound for Washington, D.C. They described artifacts too extraordinary to be ignored. Statues, gold idols, and hieroglyphic inscriptions unlike anything found in the Americas. Yet the official Smithsonian archives contained no record of such shipments, and curators' logs from 1909 appeared to skip key dates. There were sudden blank spaces, abrupt interruptions in field notes, as though pages had been deliberately removed. By 1911, all trace of the original Arizona Gazette article had disappeared from most newspaper archives. The story was omitted from public microfilm records, and requests to view early editions of the paper were denied. When researchers revisited the Gazette's files decades later, they were told those records were lost in a warehouse fire. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Still, whispers persisted. In private correspondence, a few former Smithsonian staff mentioned sealed storage areas known informally as the vault. Inside, according to one account, were anomalous artifacts of uncertain classification. One retired assistant curator described a golden idol, half serpent, half man, wrapped in canvas and stamped Canyon Collection. He was dismissed shortly after the claim reached his supervisors. To understand why such a discovery might be hidden, we must look at the mindset of that era. The early 1900s were dominated by the concept of racial and cultural hierarchy. Western civilization, especially Europe, was seen as the pinnacle of progress. If evidence emerged proving that an ancient, technologically advanced culture once existed in the Americas, it would have shattered those beliefs. It would mean that the so-called New World was not new at all, but part of an ancient global network. Such a revelation threatened not only academic reputations, but also national narratives, and institutions like the Smithsonian had everything to lose. There are stories, too many to dismiss, about sealed caverns and destroyed evidence. In 1956, a retired Army engineer named Harold Stone claimed in a local radio interview that he had been part of a federal operation tasked with sealing an entrance in Marble Canyon. He said they used dynamite to collapse a tunnel and were warned never to speak of it again. The interview aired once before disappearing from all station archives, and the recording has never been found. Over the next decades, hikers and local residents began reporting strange government activity around restricted canyon areas. They spoke of patrols with no identifiable insignia, men using advanced equipment, and newly fenced-off regions labeled environmental protection zones. The pattern was consistent. Anyone who got too close was warned away. In 1977, a determined archaeologist named Dr. Elaine Whitmore began investigating the legend. She filed formal requests with the Smithsonian, citing the original 1909 article. The reply she received was curt: "No such records exist." Yet days later, she received an anonymous package containing sketches of underground chambers and a torn tag reading Cat. 1097 Grand Canyon. Whitmore believed she was on the verge of uncovering something enormous. In 1982, during a solo expedition, she vanished. Her car was later found parked near the canyon rim, her field notes scattered inside. The final entry ended mid-sentence. The entrance is beneath the she was never found. For those who continued the search, the pattern was undeniable. Whenever someone tried to dig deeper, metaphorically or literally, they were silenced, discredited, or simply disappeared. It was as if an invisible hand was guarding the canyon's secret. Researchers comparing Smithsonian records from the early 1900s noticed dozens of unclassified items marked as relocated or removed from public catalog. When these notations were cross-referenced with transport logs, they matched shipments from Arizona dated April 1909. The paper trail was faint but unmistakable. In 1999, an anonymous whistleblower, known only as Raven, leaked what they claimed was an internal Smithsonian memo. It described a containment protocol for discoveries that contradicted established chronological frameworks. Among the listed sites was Canyon Site X-17. The memo was never authenticated, and Raven's identity remains unknown. Their online accounts vanished within days of the leak. At the same time, pilots flying low over the canyon began reporting restricted air zones. One helicopter operator claimed to have seen geometric light patterns deep within an area marked off-limits on all maps. When he reported it to authorities, his license was suspended for unauthorized airspace entry. Could all of this be coincidence? Skeptics argue that legends grow around any unexplained gap in history. Perhaps the canyon's city was nothing more than a misinterpreted cave, or perhaps Kincaid never existed at all. But if that were true, why the secrecy? Why deny the existence of something so inconsequential? The Smithsonian insists it is merely upholding scientific integrity. Without verifiable evidence, they say, no claim should be recognized. And yet, history teaches us that institutions often conceal truths until they can control the narrative. Galileo's heliocentric theory was banned. The Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden for years. The discovery of Troy was dismissed as fantasy until it was unearthed stone by stone. Perhaps, in time, the Grand Canyon will reveal its truth as well. Modern researchers have not given up. Using advanced ground-penetrating radar and drones, they have detected unusual voids beneath the canyon surface, vast, symmetrical chambers too regular to be natural. When requests for excavation are filed, they are swiftly denied under Environmental Protection Acts. No one outside the federal agencies has been permitted to explore those areas since. Some researchers believe the truth goes deeper than archaeology, that it ties into the very foundation of America's scientific institutions. The Smithsonian, they argue, is not simply a museum, but a gatekeeper. Its mission is to preserve knowledge, but also perhaps to decide what knowledge humanity is ready for. The most unsettling idea is that the story of G. Kincaid was not a race to protect science, but to protect stability. If humanity learned that an ancient, forgotten civilization once flourished on American soil, it would upend not only history books but religious beliefs, national pride, and cultural hierarchies. Perhaps the canyon holds not one secret, but many, and those who guard it believe some truths are better left buried. As night falls over the Grand Canyon, the wind sweeps through its corridors like the breath of a forgotten god. The Colorado River glimmers under the moonlight, winding through shadows that have watched the rise and fall of worlds. Somewhere down there, beneath the layers of stone and silence, may lie the ruins of a civilization too old or too powerful for us to comprehend. And perhaps, after all these years, the real question is not whether the Smithsonian covered up Kincaid's discovery. It is why they would go to such lengths to make sure we never find out. Because if the walls beneath the canyon could speak, they might tell us that history is not what we think it is. It is a story rewritten again and again, not by the victors, but by those who choose what must remain hidden. The year was 1933. The Great Depression had hollowed out the soul of America. Unemployment reached nearly 25%, banks had collapsed, and people stood in endless bread lines wondering whether the dream of democracy had failed. In that chaos, while Franklin D. Roosevelt was preparing to reshape the country with his New Deal, a far darker plan was brewing in the shadows, one that could have replaced the U.S. government with a fascist dictatorship. Few Americans today know how close the country came to losing its democracy. It began not with soldiers or politicians, but with money and the fear of losing it. Some of the wealthiest industrialists and bankers of the time, men linked to major corporations like DuPont, J.P. Morgan, and General Motors, watched FDR's reforms with growing unease. His New Deal policies promised jobs, relief, and hope to ordinary citizens. But to them, it sounded like socialism, a threat to their fortunes and power. And so, according to later investigations, a secret plan began to form to overthrow the president and replace him with a figurehead sympathetic to business and military rule. The man they allegedly approached for this audacious plan was Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history. Butler was a war hero, respected by veterans and the public alike. To the conspirators, he was the perfect choice, patriotic, disciplined, and capable of rallying soldiers. But they underestimated his loyalty. When representatives of the wealthy elite approached Butler with their proposal, claiming they could mobilize a private army of 500,000 men, Butler listened carefully. And then, instead of joining them, he blew the whistle. Butler went before Congress and revealed everything. He testified that a group of influential businessmen had tried to recruit him to lead a coup against FDR. Newspapers at first dismissed it as absurd, a fantasy of a retired general. Yet when investigators began digging, they found enough evidence to confirm that some parts of Butler's story were true. The plot became known as the business plot, and although no one was ever prosecuted, the fear it stirred inside the White House was real. The U.S. had narrowly escaped a silent coup, buried before it could come to life. Imagine it. The United States, less than 2 decades after World War I, teetering on the brink of becoming a corporate-run military regime. This wasn't an isolated fantasy. It reflected the global mood of the time. Across Europe, fascism was rising. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, all had taken power by exploiting chaos and economic despair. The American elites who feared Roosevelt's policies were inspired by those regimes. They believed strongman leadership could save capitalism from masses. Had the plot succeeded, the stars and stripes might have flown over a very different kind of America. What makes this episode chilling isn't only the conspiracy itself, but how easily it could have worked. Roosevelt's security detail was limited, and the public trusted its industrial giants. A few thousand armed men in Washington could have seized the Capitol. Butler's courage, then, was more than whistleblowing. It was an act of patriotism that arguably saved the Republic. Yet history quietly buried the story. The government had little appetite to publicize that America's most powerful businessmen nearly betrayed it. Official reports downplayed the details. And soon, newspapers stopped talking about it altogether. Decades later, historians revisited the evidence. Letters, testimonies, and financial links began to paint a clearer picture. While not every detail could be verified, the pattern was undeniable. America's democracy had enemies within, driven not by ideology, but by greed and fear. The plot revealed a timeless truth, that power, when concentrated in too few hands, can become a threat to the very system that created it. Butler's warning, written years later in his famous book War is a Racket, echoed this realization. He confessed that throughout his career, he had unknowingly served corporate interests more than the American people. The business plot remains one of the most disturbing and under-discussed chapters in U.S. history. It shows that democracy isn't destroyed only by foreign enemies or invading armies. It can erode from the top down, quietly, in the boardrooms of power. Roosevelt's presidency survived, and his New Deal would go on to reshape American society. But the shadow of 1933 lingers, a reminder of how fragile freedom truly is. As we look back now, the question isn't just what if the coup had succeeded, but how many times since then has something similar almost happened without us ever knowing? In the decades that followed, America would face more covert battles, spies, propaganda, secret agencies, and wars fought in the name of democracy. But this moment, in the midst of economic despair, was the first time the United States almost turned its back on its founding ideals. And all it took to stop it was one man brave enough to say no. As the curtain falls on this episode, remember General Butler's words, "I had been a gangster for capitalism." His confession wasn't bitterness, it was awakening. In exposing the truth, he became the conscience of a nation that had lost its moral compass. The secret coup wasn't just about overthrowing a president. It was about testing the soul of a country. And for one fragile moment in history, America passed that test. It was October 28, 1943. The U.S. Navy destroyer escort USS Eldridge D-173 sat docked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, humming with unnatural energy. The war in Europe was raging, the Atlantic Ocean teeming with German submarines that threatened to choke America's supply lines. The Navy was desperate for an edge, a weapon so advanced, so secret, it could change the course of history. That morning, hundreds of sailors watched in disbelief as the Eldridge began to shimmer, distort, and then vanish into thin air. According to classified reports and later eyewitness accounts, the Philadelphia experiment was an attempt by the U.S. military to make a warship invisible to radar, and perhaps even to the human eye. The project was rumored to use electromagnetic field manipulation, based on the theories of none other than Albert Einstein, specifically his unfinished unified field theory. The idea was bold. If gravity, electricity, and magnetism were truly interconnected, perhaps they could be combined to bend light and radar waves around an object, rendering it invisible. What happened next has become one of the most debated mysteries in American history. Witnesses described a blinding blue-green light, a field of distortion surrounding the ship. Then, the Eldridge disappeared. Moments later, it reappeared miles away, at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, before vanishing again and returning to Philadelphia. The event supposedly lasted only minutes, but what came back was not the same ship, nor the same crew. Sailors stumbled on deck screaming, some burned, others vomiting or disoriented. But the most horrific claims came from those who said that several crewmen had become fused into the metal hull itself. Their bodies half submerged, their skin melded with steel. Others were said to have simply vanished, gone forever, as though erased from existence. Those who survived were reportedly placed under strict military quarantine. Some are institutionalized, their testimonies sealed. The Navy has always denied that such an experiment ever occurred. Officially, it claims the Eldridge was simply undergoing routine radar testing, and that any strange light effects were due to degaussing, a magnetic field technique used to make ships less detectable to mines. Yet declassified correspondence and witness interviews tell a different story. The first public mention came in 1955, when a man named Carl M. Allen, better known as Carlos Allende, sent letters to researchers describing what he had witnessed while serving on a nearby merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. He claimed to have seen the Eldridge disappear before his eyes. Allende's letters referenced Einstein's unified field theory, suggesting the Navy had used it to bend electromagnetic energy around the ship. Skeptics called him a hoaxer, but others were intrigued. Over time, more alleged witnesses came forward. Some spoke of crew disappearances, others of government cover-ups and erased service records. When researchers tried to contact sailors who had supposedly served aboard the Eldridge, many names were either missing or classified. The deeper they dug, the stranger it got. By the 1970s, the story had evolved from secret weapon to time travel experiment gone wrong. Conspiracy researchers proposed that the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just about invisibility. It had accidentally opened a rift in space-time, throwing parts of the ship and crew into another dimension. Some even linked it to Project Rainbow, a rumored precursor to the Montauk Project, another supposed military time travel experiment conducted decades later. Eyewitnesses who claimed to have survived described bizarre side effects: memory loss, teleportation, and spontaneous freezing, moments where time seemed to stop for them. These testimonies, while unverified, fueled decades of speculation. To believers, this wasn't science fiction. It was the dark frontier of wartime science. If true, the Philadelphia experiment represents a terrifying moment in U.S. history when science, desperation, and secrecy collided, and reality itself was the casualty. But if it was a hoax, how did it endure for so long? How did so many details, ship names, base locations, and electromagnetic experiments line up so neatly? To understand that, we must look at the world America was living in. In 1943, the line between science and the supernatural was thinner than ever. Quantum mechanics was rewriting physics, and Einstein himself was struggling with theories that suggested time and space could warp. The U.S. was also experimenting with radar cloaking, microwave technology, and electromagnetic propulsion. Classified projects were everywhere, and secrecy was the rule. It was the perfect environment for rumors to grow into legends, and legends to hide the truth. What truly happened in Philadelphia that October morning may never be fully known. But the silence surrounding it, the destroyed documents, the missing witnesses, the denial that came too quickly, has kept the mystery alive for more than 80 years. Perhaps the experiment's greatest success wasn't invisibility at all, but erasing the evidence. The Cold War was more than an arms race. It was a war of fear, paranoia, and deception. By the early 1960s, the United States was obsessed with one small island just 90 miles off its coast, Cuba. After Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, the once American-friendly island had turned communist, aligning with the Soviet Union. To Washington, it was unthinkable. Communism had arrived in the Western Hemisphere. Every politician, general, and CIA agent believed that if Cuba wasn't stopped, it would spark a domino effect across Latin America. What followed was a string of failed attempts to overthrow Castro, the most embarrassing being the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Hundreds of CIA-trained Cuban exiles stormed the beaches, expecting local support. None came. Castro's forces crushed them in days. For the U.S. military and intelligence community, it was humiliation on a global scale. The Pentagon was furious and determined to make sure America never looked weak again. That frustration gave birth to one of the most chilling proposals ever drafted on U.S. soil. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's highest-ranking military officers, approved a secret plan called Operation Northwoods. It was a blueprint for a false flag operation, a staged series of attacks on American targets, designed to trick the public and justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. The plan didn't come from fringe extremists. It came from the Pentagon itself. The document was real, stamped, top secret, and signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. When it was finally declassified decades later, it revealed the unthinkable, that American military leaders had proposed killing their own citizens to provoke a war. The Northwoods proposal outlined in cold, bureaucratic language what reads like a script for a dystopian thriller. It suggested that U.S. intelligence agents could stage hijackings of civilian airliners and blame it on Cuban terrorists, sink a boat of Cuban refugees, using fake funerals to sell the narrative, explode bombs in American cities, including Miami and Washington, and plant evidence linking Cuba, falsify aircraft interceptions, using fake radio transmissions to simulate Cuban aggression. Each plan was designed not only to fool the American public, but also to manipulate the world into supporting U.S. retaliation. The memo even recommended creating fake lists of victims and running public mourning campaigns to amplify outrage. The logic was chillingly simple. If the people wouldn't support another war, manufacture a reason they couldn't ignore. In one particularly disturbing section, planners proposed simulating the destruction of an American passenger plane, claiming that all aboard had died when, in fact, the aircraft would secretly land and carefully selected passengers would be replaced with fake bodies. The rest of the world would see only headlines, "Cuba shoots down U.S. airliner." It sounds like fiction, but every line came from real military memos. To the men in uniform, this wasn't evil, it was strategy. To them, defeating communism justified any means. The end goal was to push the United States into war, topple Castro, and reclaim control over Cuba. But one man in the White House refused to play along: President John F. Kennedy. When Northwoods reached his desk, Kennedy was horrified. He and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara immediately rejected the plan, calling it both dangerous and immoral. But the fact that it had been approved by the Joint Chiefs shook them to the core. It revealed how far the military establishment was willing to go, not against an enemy, but against its own people. In the months that followed, tensions between Kennedy and the Pentagon grew toxic. General Lemnitzer was quietly reassigned, his trust with the president shattered. Yet Northwoods didn't die. It was filed away, archived, and classified. For nearly 40 years, no one outside the top brass knew it had ever existed. It wasn't until 1997, when the Assassination Records Review Board, a government committee declassifying documents related to JFK's assassination, accidentally uncovered the Northwoods file. When journalists read it, disbelief turned to horror. Headlines screamed of a Pentagon plot to stage terror attacks. The public could hardly believe their own government had once written such words. Suddenly, history took on a darker tone. The Northwoods revelations raised haunting questions. How many other secret proposals like this had existed? How far would governments go to justify wars? And perhaps most disturbingly, was this plan truly abandoned or merely replaced by subtler methods of deception? For decades, conspiracy theorists had whispered about false flags and covert manipulations. With Northwoods, those whispers had proof. The plan became a symbol, a smoking gun that confirmed the capacity of powerful institutions to betray public trust. Yet, there's another layer to the story: why it happened in the first place. The early 1960s were defined by fear of annihilation. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear standoff, and every move was seen through the lens of survival. To the Pentagon, the world was black and white: freedom or communism, life or extinction. That mindset justified anything. When people live under constant fear, morality bends. The architects of Northwoods didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as saviors of democracy. Still, Kennedy's refusal to go along made him enemies within his own government. Many historians have since noted that his clashes with the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, and intelligence agencies over Cuba, Vietnam, and covert operations created deep internal resentment. Less than 2 years after rejecting Northwoods, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, a tragedy that remains one of the most debated events in modern history. Was there a connection? Most historians say no, but the timing fuels endless speculation. Kennedy's death, in the eyes of many, marked the moment when America's idealism died and secrecy became the new normal. After Northwoods, the military learned an important lesson. Deception didn't have to be loud. It could be subtle: media manipulation, staged narratives, controlled leaks. The methods evolved, but the motive remained: control public perception to justify power. When we examine Northwoods today, its pages read less like an artifact and more like a mirror. Its logic, fear as a weapon, lies as protection, echoes through decades of policy. From Vietnam's Gulf of Tonkin incident, which falsely claimed North Vietnamese aggression to start a war, to modern intelligence failures, the pattern is hauntingly familiar. History doesn't always repeat, but it rhymes. And sometimes, the rhyme sounds like the ticking of a hidden clock, waiting for the next moment. Fear outweighs truth. In the end, Operation Northwoods was never carried out, but it revealed something far more terrifying than any bomb or invasion. It showed that within the very heart of democracy lay the blueprint for deception. When you read its memos, You can almost hear the cold logic of bureaucracy. Loss of life would be regrettable, but necessary. The language is sterile, but behind it beats the same human flaw that has fueled countless atrocities, the belief that the ends justify the means. The real danger of Northwoods isn't that it failed, it's that it was ever written. Because once a government imagines such plans, even in theory, it proves that the line between patriotism and tyranny is thinner than we dare to admit. As the 21st century unfolds, the ghost of Operation Northwoods lingers, a reminder that truth is fragile, secrecy is powerful, and history's darkest moments often begin not with action, but with approval. In that sense, the real operation never ended. It just changed names. In the dark heart of the Cold War, fear ruled everything. Fear of the Soviets, fear of nuclear war, fear of losing control. But there was one fear that consumed the CIA more than any other, the fear that the human mind itself could be hacked. The year was 1953. A top-secret program was born inside the Central Intelligence Agency. Its mission, to explore how to control, manipulate, and reprogram human behavior. Its codename, MKUltra. On paper, it sounded like science fiction. In reality, it became one of the most disturbing and unethical government experiments in American history. Over 2 decades, the CIA secretly dosed civilians with LSD, hypnotized soldiers, electroshock patients, and destroyed countless lives, all in pursuit of one impossible goal: creating a real-life Manchurian candidate, a person whose mind could be programmed to obey commands without question. The birth of a monster. MKUltra grew out of Cold War paranoia. After World War II, U.S. intelligence agencies learned that the Soviet Union and China were conducting psychological warfare experiments, allegedly brainwashing prisoners of war. The CIA panicked. If the enemy could control minds, America needed to do it first. So they turned to a man named Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who would become known as the Black Sorcerer of the CIA. Gottlieb was brilliant and utterly ruthless. He was given unlimited funding, near total secrecy, and one terrifying mission: to find the key to mind control. The project operated under layers of fake fronts and coded subprojects, 149 in total. Hospitals, universities, and prisons across the U.S. unknowingly participated. Most had no idea their research was being directed by the CIA. The CIA believed LSD might be the ultimate truth serum, a drug capable of breaking down resistance and revealing secrets buried deep in the mind. Gottlieb ordered massive quantities of the drug from Swiss manufacturer Sandoz and began testing it, not on volunteers, but on unsuspecting people. CIA agents spiked each other's drinks. Prostitutes were paid to lure men into safe houses in San Francisco, where they were secretly filmed and dosed with LSD while behind one-way mirrors. The operation was nicknamed Midnight Climax. In hospitals and universities, patients seeking treatment for depression or addiction were unknowingly given hallucinogens and subjected to psychological torture. Some were kept drugged for weeks at a time. One patient, a Canadian woman named Linda MacDonald, was put into a chemically induced coma for 86 days and subjected to repeated electroshock treatments, all funded under MKUltra's Canadian branch, Subproject 68. Many never recovered. Some lost their memories permanently. Others committed suicide. The most famous casualty was Dr. Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who worked with the CIA. In 1953, Olson attended a retreat with Gottlieb and other scientists. Unbeknownst to him, his drink was secretly dosed with LSD. Within days, Olson began experiencing severe paranoia and guilt over his work in biological weapons and mind control research. He told his wife he wanted to resign. A week later, he fell to his death on the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The CIA called it suicide, but decades later, declassified documents revealed that the agency had been monitoring Olson and possibly silenced him. When his body was exhumed in the 1990s, forensic experts found evidence of blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting he was struck before falling. His son, Eric Olson, has spent his life seeking the truth. The Olson case exposed MKUltra to public light, but only partially. By 1973, amid growing suspicion about CIA abuses, the agency's new director, Richard Helms, ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Millions of pages vanished overnight. What remained were fragments, 20,000 documents mistakenly misfiled elsewhere. These scraps would later form the basis of congressional investigations. When the Church Committee in 1975 and the Rockefeller Commission began probing the CIA, the revelations stunned the world. Senators read aloud reports of prisoners, mental patients, and even children being used as test subjects. In one experiment, 7 inmates in Kentucky were given LSD daily for 77 days straight. In another, a group of homeless men were lured with alcohol and then dosed with powerful hallucinogens. One test subject was a young mother treated for postpartum depression. She emerged from her therapy unable to remember her own children. The U.S. government officially admitted MKUltra's existence in 1977, but insisted the project was limited in scope. Yet witnesses testified otherwise. Some described human experiments that bordered on psychological torture, extreme sensory deprivation, hypnosis combined with drugs, and attempts to induce amnesia. What made MKUltra so chilling wasn't just what it did, but why it was done. It wasn't conducted by rogue scientists or underground criminals. It was authorized, funded, and protected by the government itself. It revealed a dangerous truth. When fear becomes policy, morality disappears. The same government that championed freedom was secretly turning its own citizens into lab rats. MKUltra wasn't an isolated event. It shaped decades of covert research. Many of its scientists later went on to work for NASA, DARPA, and private defense contractors. Techniques born in MKUltra, sensory isolation, psychological profiling, hypnosis, later resurfaced in military interrogation programs and behavioral studies. The human cost remains impossible to measure. Because records were destroyed, most victims will never know they were part of an experiment. Some families still search for answers, piecing together fragments from medical records, letters, and declassified files. In 1995, President Bill Clinton publicly apologized for past unethical government experiments on civilians, though MKUltra was never directly named. A handful of survivors received small settlements, but for many, no justice was ever served. One victim, a former CIA operative who later became a whistleblower, described it this way: "We were trying to create control, but we ended up proving that no one can ever control the human mind." The irony is haunting. The CIA spent millions trying to break the will of human consciousness, only to discover its resilience. From a scientific perspective, MKUltra's logic wasn't entirely fantasy. By the 1950s, psychologists understood that behavior could be shaped through conditioning. Combine that with new drugs, hypnosis, and trauma, and the dream of reprogramming a human seemed plausible. But science without ethics is madness. The program crossed every moral line imaginable. It blurred the boundary between medicine and manipulation, therapy and torture, science and sin. Some researchers involved later claimed ignorance. They believed they were studying memory or consciousness. But others knew exactly what they were doing. One psychiatrist involved in Canadian experiments later admitted, "We were destroying people in the name of science." MKUltra was officially shut down in 1973, but its influence never truly ended. Techniques developed during the project found their way into interrogation manuals used in Vietnam, Latin America, and Iraq. The same psychological principles, breaking identity, inducing compliance, reappeared decades later in reports from Guantanamo Bay and CIA black sites. Some researchers argue that the rise of modern behavior modification technologies, subliminal messaging, neurofeedback, even certain digital persuasion techniques, all trace philosophical roots to MKUltra's ambitions. The methods have changed, but the desire to influence the mind remains. Even in pop culture, the shadow of MKUltra lives on, from the Manchurian Candidate to Stranger Things. What was once unthinkable has become part of collective memory. So, what was MKUltra really trying to achieve? To create assassins? To extract confessions? To erase memory? The truth is murkier than any of those. Declassified notes reveal the program had no single goal. It was a sprawling, chaotic hunt for ultimate control. In the end, it failed. No super soldier was ever created. No true mind control formula was ever found. But the damage was done to science, to ethics, and to human trust. The story of MKUltra is more than just a scandal. It's a warning that even in a democracy, secrecy can rot morality from within. When citizens are told that fear justifies anything, that ends justify means history repeats itself. MKUltra stands as proof that the most dangerous weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but belief that we can control what should never be controlled. The program's final files end abruptly. The last line reads, "Future work will be continued under new guidance." No one knows what that meant, or whether that future work ever truly ended. Some say it evolved into new classified programs under different names. Others believe MKUltra became a myth to hide even darker realities. But one fact remains. For 20 years, the U.S. government tried to own the human mind, and in doing so, it nearly lost its own soul. As the Cold War faded, MKUltra slipped into history's shadows. But the echoes remain in every debate about surveillance, psychological warfare, and freedom of thought. Because when truth itself can be engineered, the only defense left is awareness. And awareness is exactly why we tell these stories. And so, we've reached the end of our journey through the fascinating history of the Grand Canyon. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the ancient civilizations, the geological wonders, and the human stories that have shaped this incredible natural treasure with me. If you found this video insightful and engaging, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to my channel for more in-depth explorations of history, nature, and the world's most amazing places. Your support means a lot, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious. Goodbye for now.